Hey everybody, Tony Cottaspotty here from Great Vocal Majority, and today we're going to talk about a topic that you probably thought is about 20 years overdue, almost literally, to talk about. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to why Marx and communism failed. Now you may think that this topic went out of vogue maybe in 1991 when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries failed uh, in their experiment with Marxism and Leninism. But actually, it's not true. We still have countries in the world. Most obvious one is China, which is still a Marxist-Leninist country. We have Cuba, we have North Korea, Vietnam. There's a number of countries that are still considered and still consider themselves Marxist-Leninist. And what I wanted to talk about is why that philosophy has failed. Even though there are still countries that operate under that philosophy ostensibly, I'd like to talk about why it has failed. So let's talk about that. And let's start with a couple of questions. First question is, what is communism? You know, there's a lot of people use that term. It's almost sometimes used as a pejorative. You're a communist. But most people don't even know what they're referring to. Usually when they say that, they're referring to somebody, they're thinking of Joe Stalin or Mao Zedong in their head, and that's in their minds, that's what they're saying. But communism, according to the dictionary, is just a definition of a system where the economic means of production are collectively owned. They're owned by society at large. And we'll get into this a little bit deeper. Don't worry, we're not going to go like deep dive into it, but we're gonna get into it a little bit deeper, because it's a society without a state, without money, and without class distinctions. And now if you stop and think about it, you have to admit to yourself, under this definition, there's never been a communist country in the world, ever. So these countries that we refer to as communist aren't communist under this definition, but I'll explain why we can still refer to them as communist also in a moment. So now there's yet another question. We're going to go through a few of these. Is communism the same as socialism? Well, no. But they are related, and I'm going to explain how they are related. First of all, the state and money do not exist in communist societies, but they do in socialist ones. So communists see socialism as a necessary step in order to achieve communism. So you can look at it as they see communism as, socialism rather, as sort of communism with the training wheels still on. Let's talk about another question. Who was Karl Marx? Who was this guy? We hear a lot about him. We've heard a lot about him. He's becoming back in vogue now with this new Piketty book that does the analysis of the economy and stuff like that. And a lot of this is from a Marxist point of view. But who was Karl Marx? Well, you know, just generally, he was a German economist and sociologist, and he formulated a theory of politics and economics, which eventually became known as Marxism. But when he was alive, he and his partner, Friedrich Engels, referred to it as scientific socialism. But what is that? What is scientific socialism? That we've heard of other forms of socialism, right? You may have heard of the term utopian socialism. And most people look at socialism, the true socialism and the true communism, as I showed you in the one of the first slides. It sounds utopian. You know, a society without a state, without money, without classes of any class distinctions of any kind. That does sound utopian. But Marx says, no, we're going to go scientific with our socialist theory. So what is it? Well, scientific socialism is that term that Marx used, and it's supposedly based on the scientific method, and it's held to an empirical standard. In other words, it needs to be observed. There has to be factual observation that's essential for the development of Marxist theory. But we're going to put that to the test right now. And we're going to still ask some questions. And now the question is, how did Marx view nature and knowledge under scientific socialism? Well, Marx, as well as other communists, believe in the philosophy of materialism. And now what is materialism? Well, materialism is essentially the belief that all knowledge has its basis in matter. In other words, that materialists believe that science, if it could know everything there was to know about matter itself, they would know everything they could know. They would know everything. They don't believe in anything beyond matter. For example, they don't believe in the metaphysical. They don't believe in spiritual. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in a creator. They believe in anything that's tangible. That's it. There's no reality beyond matter. So scientific socialists like Marx think that they have the answer to three very basic questions. Those questions are, what is the origin of energy and motion in nature? The other question they answer is, what causes the elements of nature to increase in numbers? There is this phenomena that we do see in nature, and does exist, and we have observed it, where populations expand, unless they're acted on otherwise by forces that serve to either diminish or eliminate those populations, populations do tend to expand. We also see the universe is expanding. We see stars are created, planets are formed, galaxies. We see all of this. There's a proliferation that happens in nature. And the question is, what causes that? Then the third question they say they answer are, what are the origins of life and different species and even of human consciousness? What creates all this? Because remember, in things like natural law, natural law it does form the basis of the American system and most of Western society. That has a more metaphysical background because there is a belief in a supreme being in natural law. So in natural law, the origins of life, species, and human consciousness would be the creator. However you want to describe it. You can describe the creator as nature itself, or you could describe the creator as a force that some people will refer to as God. So Marx put together three laws of matter. And those laws are supposed to, I think, really act as a competitor or an alternative view of reality from natural law. And so he laid out these three laws, and everything in Marxism that you know about, class warfare and all the different things about economics and redistribution of wealth and the emergence of the socialist state and the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and the whole 9 yards, all of that stuff arises out of the laws of nature that Marx put together, and there are three of them. And the first one is called the law of opposites, and we'll get into this in a little more detail. The second law is called the law of negation, and the third law is the law of transformation. And the real question is, what are these laws? And how did these laws work under Marx's so-called scientific socialism? What was scientific about these laws, and can we really, really burrow into them and understand them? Well, first, let's look at the law of opposites. What does the law of opposites say? Marx and Engels believed that the existence of everything is a combination or a unity of opposites that create a conflict, and that conflict is autodynamic and self-energizing. And so they believed that this unity of opposites in all things, even in human beings, gave rise to motion and change in those things. And matter, just because of that, inherent conflict of opposites doesn't need an outside power source like a creator or an initial mover or, whatever. It doesn't need a God, for example. And a good way to illustrate what Marx was trying to say here is to look at the atom. In the atom, you have a nucleus that's made up of neutrons and neutrons and protons. And the protons have an opposite, have a positive charge, and they are circled by electrons that have a negative charge. And what Marx is saying is that the reason why you have protons and electrons moving is because of their inherent conflict with each other. So they move. He's saying that the fact that they are opposite of each other determines their motion. Then you have the law of negation, which is really just a philosophical way of saying dying. And what does Marx say about that? Marx and Engels believe that nature tends to multiply itself in the quantity of all things, as I mentioned earlier. They're growing populations, their nature expands in the universe, everything is expanding, everything is growing in numbers. And so Marx is attempting to explain that. And he believed that the increases occurred without any guiding intelligence. Again, going back to this rejection of a creator. And so all things in nature are constantly expanding through dying and regeneration. So what does that really mean? And what's a good example of that? Well, just think of people. Marx would say that a person, because they are aware of the fact that they're going to eventually die, that moves them to procreate, to have families or have children. And then those children will have more children. And they are also motivated by the fact that they're going to die. So this is how that happens in people. And you could just apply that to anything, even inanimate parts of the world or the universe, like planets and stars and galaxies and stuff. Then there's the law of transformation. Now, in the law of transformation, Marx and Engels believe that there is a continuous quantitative development by a particular class that often results in the creation of a new form or entity. Now, that's just fancy gobbledygook sort of philosophical talk for what I'll describe as matter alone, just by its nature, is capable of producing new forms of itself without the need of any creative or directing power external to itself. And a very simple example Marx used was the molecule of methane, which is four hydrogen atoms and a carbon atom. But if you just introduce two more hydrogen atoms and one more carbon atom, still carbon and hydrogen, you have a completely different substance called ethane. And if you do the same thing again, one more time, you have a completely different substance, a third substance called propane. So Marx believed that this proved his law, or at least demonstrated his law of transformation. Now, through these laws, Marx thought that the combination of these three laws answered questions as profound as, what is life? And he also believed he obliterated the notion of God. But did he? Well, we'll see. Let's take a look at these and more critically. So the conclusions communists or scientific socialists or whatever they like to call themselves draw from these three laws is that everything in nature came about as a result of endless motion among the forces of nature. Remember, the law of opposites said that opposites create motion. Then there was the law of negation that says things proliferate because they know they're going to die. And then the law of transformation basically says those first two laws create this endless stream of interactions, and those interactions eventually lead to new and bigger things and more progression. It almost is like a natural description of evolution in a way. It almost brings in the Darwin's theories and how things evolve. They evolve because there's a constant, interaction countless times over centuries. So, in other words, everything that exists is a product of an accumulated accident. There's no design. Like, what he's basically saying is that the reason why man exists is because there was, first, when the earth was formed, there was this, water, liquid water happened, and then there were other interactions with other molecules of different things, and just a continuous chain of events of action, interaction. Or in the Hegelian model, there's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis, and then a continuation of that process into a new thesis, a new antithesis, and a new synthesis. Marx incorporated the Hegelian dialectic model into these three theories. And he's saying that as the world developed over the billions of years, that pond scum, basically, eventually became you and me. And so, what Marx is concluding is that there is only matter and force in nature. There's nothing else at play here. Of course, there is no God, according to Marx. But there are some fatal fallacies in these laws that Marx put together that he called scientific socialism, and I'm going to go through them. First, let's talk about the law of opposites. Now, this law is supposed to explain the law of motion, but there are the two contradictory elements, like the proton and the electron, would never come together unless they already had energy. A proton has a positive charge, not because an electron has a negative one, and vice versa, but that's kind of what Marx was saying. So in nature, contradictory forces are observed as being independent of each other, and their union just combines their already existing energy and motion. It doesn't explain it. So, in other words, Marx's law of opposites fails to explain motion because it actually presupposes motion. It presupposes the motion. He's basically saying that was ever present. It doesn't explain anything. So that's the law of opposites. It doesn't really hold up. Let's move on to the next law, the law of negation. Now, this law attempts to account for numerical increases in nature, and it says that contradictory forces in an entity tend toward its own negation. Things go through life cycles. But through the process of dying, these forces of motion tend to lead to an even larger population. They believed, Marx and Engels that is, argued that these uncomprehending forces, because people, you can at least say, yeah, we comprehend that we're going to die, so we may want to procreate. That's something you can assign to a conscious entity. But what about just planets and stars? Marx and Engels believed that these uncomprehending forces of mechanical motion in nature are capable of ordering themselves to produce these intricate things, which are designed in advance to achieve a predetermined end. How can that possibly be? So this law describes a natural phenomena without explaining it. Negation is not related in any way to reproduction. I mean, you don't have children because you're going to die. That's not why you have children. And, it doesn't even matter. I mean, if you're not going to die, you are going to die whether you have children or not. One doesn't lead to the other. Even Engels knew that law could never be demonstrated in nature. And these guys are scientific socialists. They're supposed to be able to demonstrate everything. But they weren't able to demonstrate this law, the law of negation. And then the third fatal fallacy is with respect to the law of transformation. Now, this law is supposed to explain the origins of life as having spontaneously arose out of the application of the first two laws. So, in other words, you had the motion law, and then you had the negation law, and the countless interactions of matter in using those two laws eventually leads to transformational changes that lead to people and the world as you know it today. So, in other words, stated in this next bullet, life, according to Marx, arose from the accelerating motion created by a conflict of opposites and an endless cycle of negation and regeneration. In other words, human consciousness arose by accident. But all through scientific study, there has never been a case where life has been created out of something that wasn't already living. So Marx is claiming that his socialism is scientific, but in all three of his most basic and fundamental laws, there is no observable facts that prove the laws are true. In fact, we can find observable facts that prove the laws are not true. So the conclusion is, it's based on an erroneous assumption about the world. These laws are erroneous. Scientific socialism is erroneous. And when it comes to the broader understanding of socialism, Marxism, communism, and that whole theory of class warfare, class economics, and the dictatorship of the proletariat and the emergence of, the decline of capitalism and all of that stuff. In order for that organizing principle of philosophy to succeed, it must come within a reasonable proximity of the real world. But Karl Marx's theories can be totally refuted at the most basic level. And those represent the foundation of his economic analysis and his societal analysis. So how could those be any more valid than what they're based on? The answer is they can't be. But if you want a deeper understanding of these irreconcilable issues, really, with Marx's ideas, for communism, socialism, whatever, a great book, it's an old book, it was written in the very early 1960s by W. Cleon Skousen. It's called The Naked Communist. I based this chart package on that book. It's well worth your time reading if you're interested in understanding the flaws of Marxism. And it explains why the Soviet Union failed. It explains why China had to turn to a more moderate capitalistic economy. Same thing with Vietnam. It explains why Cuba is a mess. It explains why North Korea is a total mess. It explains why Vietnam has moderated and turned towards capitalism. Because capitalism comes closer to what human nature is and what reality is than the failed theories of scientific socialism and Karl Marx. That's all I had for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and visit my website, greatvocalmajority.com. I will put a link to this presentation there, and we'll speak to you soon. Thanks a lot, guys.